Hi everybody, this is the Exploitation of the Peasantry under Bureaucratic Capitalism by Cornelius Castoriadis. This was originally published in Socialisme ou Barbarie in October 1949. The agrarian problem today. We hardly need recall how enormously important the agrarian problem is for the proletarian revolution, and how the proletariat needs to rally a majority of the exploited peasant strata behind it under the banner of a socialist program. Let us simply mention the facts that highlight the importance of this problem. Today, 2 centuries after the Industrial Revolution began, the great majority of our planet's population still makes its living by farming, and it does so under conditions that most often are not directly capitalist in their nature. Approximately 2/3 of the world's population makes its living in agriculture. Half continue to do so under conditions that preserve the form of individual small landholdings, or even pre-capitalist types of property ownership, even though their content now is characterized by capital's exploitation of the peasantry. We know quite well that this fact has been used to the full in all bourgeois, quote, refutations, end quote, of Marxism, and especially in critiques of the theory of concentration. For many years, bourgeois professors, quote, proved, end quote, with as much rigor as they could muster, that capital concentration in the way Marx analyzed it quite simply was impossible and would never come to pass. When, nevertheless, this concentration began to appear even to the blind, when all the world's industry began to be dominated by a tiny number of capitalist groupings, these good men marched off to the fields and took refuge in the domain of agriculture, where one quote, knew nothing, end quote, of this process of concentration, and where everything continued to work in its old patriarchal setting. We do not intend to analyze here the question of concentration in the field of agriculture, but let us mention the fundamental aspects of the problem. 1. The existence of the process of concentration in agriculture today is undeniable. That this process goes more slowly, that it appears to occur under different modalities than it does in industry, are facts that follow from agriculture's specific characteristics, as well as from the general evolution of the economy, and from the very predominance of industrial concentration itself, as we shall see later. But these differences serve rather to confirm the law of concentration instead of contradicting the law of concentration in any way. Leaving aside the smaller scale aspects of agricultural concentration, which exist without exception in every country, let us recall simply that in the 2 principal economic powers in the world today, America and Russia, we can comprehend how agriculture has evolved since 1918 only if we examine how it has become concentrated. 2. Concentration is not a mechanical, automatic process. The predominance of the tendency toward concentration over what can be called the tendency toward the diffusion of capital basically is a result of the development of technique. The continual emergence of new, more profitable technical methods require considerable capital outlays, and the employment of a relatively smaller labor force makes it hopeless for the small industrial or agricultural enterprise to struggle against the large one. Now, for several reasons, some of which are circumstantial and some of which are not at all so, modern techniques have not been applied as rapidly in agriculture as they have been in industry. Only for the past 30 years has it been possible to say that modern methods of cultivation have begun to predominate over traditional methods. But to the extent that this is true, nothing will be able to stop any longer the industrialization of agriculture now that it has been set in motion. On the other hand, the development of capitalism in industry necessarily has had repercussions upon the movement of the agricultural population. During an initial period of time, what Marx called, quote, primitive accumulation, end quote, Industrial capitalism brutally expropriated huge masses of peasants to create for itself an abundant source of cheap labor. During its expansionary phases, however, there were times when it still did not find any other source of manpower than the agricultural population. The worldwide exodus of peasants towards the towns continues even today, and this depopulation of the countryside has served as a powerful stimulant for extending modern techniques into agriculture. Three, but the integration of agriculture into the process of concentration was carried out for a half century in a much more far-reaching manner through the gradual domination of the market by monopolies, the maintenance of the juridical form of individual ownership of land parcels, and even the maintenance to a certain extent of land parcel property as the productive unit for applying agricultural techniques, is only of a relatively secondary importance once monopolies come to have complete dominance over the market and other industrial production. It is not just that agriculture is dominated by industry in both technical terms as well as economic terms, nor that its progress is determined by improvements in industrial techniques and by progress in industrial production. What is even more important is that monopolization of key sectors of the economy, and this monopolization begins in its industrial sectors, entirely transforms the economic significance of the small enterprise. Not only is the small enterprise dominated thereafter by monopolies, which, for example, set the selling price and the purchase price of the goods it produces, as well as the price of its raw materials, implements, etc. Not only is the owner of the small enterprise exploited qua consumer, when he is obliged to contribute to the surplus profits monopolies build up, but the maintenance of the small enterprise in certain sectors of the economy, and principally in agriculture, corresponds, from the monopoly's point of view, to a profound economic necessity. In the sectors where production has not yet been completely rationalized, where risk arising from extra economic factors continue to play an important role, and this is the case par excellence in agriculture, monopolies prefer for agriculture to be integrated in a manner that guarantees those monopolies maximum profits and a minimum of losses for as long as possible. The concrete significance of maintaining land parcel farming in agriculture is that monopolies profit from agricultural production whenever things are going well, whereas land parcel farmers bear pretty much by themselves the burden of any problems, whether in the form of bad harvest or overproduction. 4. Nevertheless, there is a factor that formally is opposed to the process of concentration in agriculture, although in reality it is only a manifestation of it, and which should not be underestimated. Using the state, capitalism consciously has intervened in the countryside in order to orient the development of the rural economic and social relations in a particular direction. In different countries that had already carried out their bourgeois democratic revolution, in the traditional sense of the term, where therefore the partitioning of land and the constitution of an extremely numerous class of small holders had taken place during a time when this transformation did not pose any significant challenge to political stability. The bourgeoisie began to see correctly that maintaining this class would furnish it with one of the essential bases for its continued domination. There is nothing astonishing if from then on its agrarian policy has been oriented steadfastly toward the maintenance of a, quote, stable, end quote, economic and social structure in the area of agriculture. It is indeed one of the points upon which the relative antagonism existing within the capitalist state, which is itself the universal and abstract expression of the interests of capital and the daily interest of particular strata of capitalists, has at times been expressed most forcefully. This policy of the capitalist state has had two principal objectives: the, quote, organization, end quote, of the peasants into corporate unions, which in the final analysis are a form of rural cartel, in which the dominant role is played by its richest members, and the, quote, protection, end quote, of the agricultural population through the protection of agricultural prices, which is merely the monopolistic principle of price fixing applied to a particular sector of the economy. From the historical point of view, this capitalist state policy quite obviously is utopian, and in the final analysis, it contradicts both the interest of capital and the insuperable tendencies that the overall development of economic concentration exhibits. As such, this policy is historically doomed. It certainly will not be, quote, agricultural corporatism, end quote, that bureaucratic capitalism will be able to find its complementary structure in agriculture. Since the beginning of the 20th century and until today, however, this policy has been an important factor in the evolution of society. On several occasions, it has influenced the outcome of the class struggle in Europe. It is in the light of the analysis of the exploitation of the peasantry within the framework of bureaucratic capitalism that we will be able to find the answer to the problem of the modern forms of capitalist exploitation of the peasantry. Indeed, Russian bureaucratic capitalism both prefigures the forms under which the exploitation of the peasantry will develop within the framework of total concentration and indicates the limits to this development. The exploitation of the peasantry in Russia. The central feature of the exploitation of the peasantry in Russia is to be found in the tax the peasants have to pay in kind to the state. Both the required quantity of and the purchase price paid by the state for the produce delivered by the kolkhozy, the collective farms, can vary. Nevertheless, as a general rule, the state levies 40% of the gross product, and 20% more must be delivered to the machine tractor stations. Thus, the peasantry disposes of at most only 40% of the gross product. Thus, the peasantry disposes of at most only 40% of the gross product. And still, we are dealing here with a hypothetical percentage. In any case, we should not forget that from this gross produce, seeds must be deducted, and sometimes livestock fed as well, pushing the way monopolies do business to the absolute limit. The state unilaterally and absolutely fixes the price at which the state buys agricultural produce. This is how exploitation occurs. Here, for example, are the prices for a quintal of rye in 1933. Delivery price to the state, 6.03 rubles. Rationed price, rye flour, 25 rubles. Commercial price, rye flour, 45 rubles. Kolkhoz, open market price, Moscow region, 58 rubles. Thus the state buys this produce from the kolkhozy at a price that is extremely lower than what it is worth. Later we will try to specify the order of magnitude of this theft. This is the first and fundamental feature of the bureaucratic state's exploitation of the peasantry, and as a matter of fact, it is the one that likens this kind of exploitation to feudal exploitation. Peasants are, quote, bound to the soil, end quote. The exploiting class deducts at least half of the produce, and all this is aggravated by the ever-changing conditions of production, and by the ever-present possibility that the state will increase the length of the mandatory workday, or deduct an even greater quantity of produce. The second feature is to be found in the exploitation of the peasants as consumers. These peasants are exploited when they purchase manufactured goods they need for their personal consumption. This phenomenon already is well known under monopoly rule, but here it takes on unprecedented proportions on account of the state's absolute monopoly over all manufactured goods and the complete authority it has to fix the sale price of, quote, its, end quote, products. The price of rye in 1933, just cited as an example, also can serve here as a basis for determining an order of magnitude. The state bought the quintal of rye for 6 rubles and sold the rationed rye flour, i.e. the flour whose price is supposed to, quote, protect, end quote, or, quote, favor, end quote, the consumer, at 25 rubles a quintal. Assuming that turning rye into rye flour costs 4 rubles per quintal, 66% of the price of the raw materials, in fact, the processing cost, including loss in weight, ought to be much smaller. It, quote, earns, end quote, 15 rubles per quintal, rate of profit 150%, i.e. it takes back from urban working class consumers 60% of the part of their wages they spend on rye flour. In the 25 rubles the consumer was paying for this quintal of rye flour, 10 rubles at most represented the real, quote, cost, end quote, of the product for the state, and the other 15 the latter's profit, pure and simple. This example is indeed purely theoretical, for the worker never would have had the opportunity, during the various periods of time when rationing was in effect, to fully satisfy his needs with official rations. He is forced to resort either to the state, quote, free, end quote, shops or the Kosniki's open market. In the first case, by paying 45 rubles a quintal for rye flour, he will be exploited by the state on 80% of the value of his purchases, the state making a net gain of 35 rubles per quintal sold. In the second case, he would pay 58 rubles per quintal, and it would be the kolkhozniki who would, quote, profit, end quote, from it. But again, it is the state that wins, although indirectly, because the price of agricultural products on the open market has to cover a certain, quote, overall profitability, end quote, of the agricultural enterprise. With all of its revenues, both those resulting from the deliveries to the state as well as those coming from sales on the open market, the peasant class has to be able to cover all its basic needs. The exorbitant price of produce on the open market only helps to compensate for the spoliatory price the state gets for the purchase the state makes. And the lower this last price, the higher the prices on the open market will rise. The example allows us to make a rough calculation of the order of magnitude of the exploitation that results from the mandatory delivery of produce at the state's spoliatory prices. Let X be the production cost of a quintal of rye. The cost of 10 quintals then will be 100x, and this price should equal all the revenues the kolkhoz will receive from these 100 quintals. These revenues break down according to the previously cited figures as follows: 60 quintals delivered to the state and to the MTS at the price of 6 rubles per quintal, 15 to 20 quintals sold on the open market at 85 rubles per quintal, and 20 to 25 quintals consumed in kind. We can account for the latter on the basis of their production cost. Thus, 100x equals 60.6 plus 20.58 plus 20x, which gives us x equal to 19. The production cost per quintal of wheat, therefore, is 19 rubles. By deducting 60% of production at a price of 6 rubles, the state steals from the peasants the difference between the cost of 60 quintals and what they are paid for it. This is a difference of 60.19 minus 60.6 equal to 1,140 minus 360 equal to 780. On the total value of 100 quintals, which is 19.1, equal to 1,900 rubles, this spoliation surpasses 40%. This spoliation is only one of the features of the bureaucracy's exploitation of the peasantry. The second one mentioned earlier occurs when the state sells industrial products to the peasants at marked up prices. We have just seen that in the case of rye flour sold to urban workers, the latter are cheated on their wages on the order of 60%. We do not have the data that would allow us to determine the order of magnitude corresponding to the amount the peasants are cheated. There is no reason to believe, however, that it would be any smaller. The third feature of this exploitation is to be found in the differentiation of incomes among the peasantry, whether it be between different kolkhozy or within the same kolkhoz. Although the effect and the social function of this differentiation are the same, its concrete bases vary according to the circumstances. The fact that, quote, millionaire and, quote, kolkhozniki exist not only is not hidden, it is triumphantly and cynically proclaimed by the bureaucracy. We must look at the economic underpinning of this phenomenon. To begin with, the kolkhozy are equal in size in comparison to the number of producers on each kolkhoz, as well as in relation to the fertility of their soil and the value of their produce. There are small, medium-sized, and large kolkhozy relative to the number of members each one has. There are kolkhozy whose soil is extremely fertile and others whose soil is average or poor. Some kolkhozy are designated to cultivate produce that is bought by the state at higher prices than other produce, for example, all non-food crops. Some kolkhozy are served better than others by the MTS. Some have a greater number of tractors at their disposal than others, and some, on the basis of previous harvest, can pay their tractor drivers and other operators better than others can. Thus, as of November 15, 1938, 5,000 MTS owed 206 million rubles to their drivers. Naturally, they have abandoned the kolkhozy served by these stations. On the other hand, 0.3% of all kolkhozy in 1939 were millionaire kolkhozy, while 6% of all kolkhozy were poor, with an annual income of 1,000 to 5,000 rubles. 75% of the kolkhozy were medium-sized and have an annual income of 60,000 rubles, though this amounts to only 172 rubles per member per year. This income is dreadfully below the nominal income of the average worker. Obviously, the varying degrees of fertility of the soil have tremendous effects on the differentiation of incomes. In 1937, 8% of the kolkhozy were given less than 1.5 kilos of grain per work day for each kolkhoznik. 50% of the kolkhozy were given up to 3 kilos. 10% were given 7 to 15 kilos, and 0.3% more than 15 kilos. Thus, differences in pay were greater than tenfold. On the other hand, within the same kolkhoz, extreme pay differences prevailed for different types of work and degrees of skill. Thus, the workday of an agricultural laborer is figured as half of a standard, quote, workday, end quote, and that of a tractor driver is calculated as 5 workdays. We can combine these figures with those given previously concerning pay differences for an average workday in different kolkhozy. We would reach the following monstrous conclusion. A tractor driver in a rich kolkhoz, which pays 15 kilos of grain for a workday, would earn 5 times 15 equal to 75 kilos per workday, whereas an unskilled laborer is in a poor kolkhoz, which pays 1.5 kilos for a workday, would earn 0.5 times 1.5 equal to 0.75 kilos per workday. Despite everything known about income inequalities in the Russian system, we hesitate in a case that seems like it has to be routine to grant a differentiation from 1 to 100. Nevertheless, the figures are there, obstinately staring at us, and we do not know how else to interpret them. The principal economic basis for the differentiations among the kolkhozy obviously comes from the fact that the abolition of private ownership of the soil on the juridical level has not done away with private ownership's economic manifestations, which is ground rent. It is obvious that the greater the advantages resulting from the larger size of the kolkhozy, the greater the differentiation of incomes among the different types of work, which is only the replication in the countryside of the bureaucratic regime's basic way of carrying out exploitation in the factories. There is also a mode of differentiation, peculiar to agriculture, that results from differential rents. Those agricultural enterprises that have the most fertile soil, that are best situated in relation to economic centers, etc., profit from these differences. In the abstract, the bureaucratic state could equalize the differences resulting from these factors and distribute the burden of its exploitation uniformly over the entire peasantry. It does not do this because it pursues a conscious social policy that is consistent with both the stratification of the peasantry and the creation of a privileged stratum of peasants. This privileged stratum cannot but ally itself with the rural bureaucracy, since the basis for its comfortable status is precisely the kolkhoz system as it currently exists. Under these conditions, where the peasantry is exploited more heavily than under the ancien regime, we may understand how the peasantry becomes more and more disinterested in producing for the kolkhoz. Whence the tendency of the peasants to devote more and more of their time to farming their little individual plots and to furnish the minimum possible amount of work to the kolkhoz. Whence, in turn, the absolute necessity for the bureaucratic state to instaurate forced labor in kolkhoz production, which is the sole source of supply for agricultural produce. We will not dwell here on the concrete modes this type of forced labor takes. Let us simply draw from the official information we have at our disposal an index of the amount of time the Russian peasant spends laboring on behalf of the kolkhoz and on his own behalf. We know that before the war, peasants in the kolkhozy spent 30 to 45% of their time farming their individual plots. We also know that in 1940, the average amount of labor the peasant had to contribute to the kolkhoz was 262 workdays a year. This means that at this time the kolkhoz year amounted to between 374 and 478 workdays. In 1943, when the, quote, average contribution, end quote, had gone up to 340 workdays per kolkhoznik per year, the peasant probably had to work between 500 and 600 workdays per year. Obviously, these figures only have a very limited significance since we do not know exactly what constitutes a, quote, workday, end quote. Assuming that it represents 8 hours of work, a year of 500 theoretical days thus would be equivalent to 4,000 hours, or 52 weeks of 77 hours of work. We see that the burden of this exploitation is enormous, both from the point of view of the time worked and from that of the spoliation of the product. The result is that the amount of interest the peasants have in producing can only be nil or even negative. Nevertheless, production must continue. It must increase more and more. What must increase above all is production for the kolkhoz, the indispensable basis for state-run production. And since the kolkhoz peasants do not want to cooperate in production, they must be compelled to do so. Here is the real economic basis of the monstrous kolkhoz bureaucracy, the ever greater control and coercion exercised over the mass of the peasantry, in order to compel it to farm for the kolkhoz, i.e. to produce for the state. According to fairly modest estimates, 1 million bureaucrats belong to the kolkhoz bureaucracy, president of the kolkhozy, officials of all kinds, deputies, accountants, etc., not counting actual party officials and those local authorities who live on the backs of the peasantry. We have arrived at this figure by counting 4 bureaucrats per kolkhoz on the average. There are about 250,000 kolkhozy in all of Russia. Here is what the official Russian press says about them. Quote, when the annual financial reports are examined, one is struck by the obvious inflation of administrative and management expenses. Among the, quote, jobs, end quote, listed on the personnel rolls are found, quote, general cultural propagandist, end quote. Quote, director of the Red Izbas, end quote, propaganda organizations. Quote, stewards, end quote. They have eaten up a considerable portion of the kolkhozy's revenues. In 1940, in the, quote, power to the Soviets, end quote, kolkhoz, the administrative personnel totted up 12,287 workdays and 37 breeding workers, 9,872. In the, quote, dawn, end quote, kolkhoz, there are only 2 kolkhozy brigades, but the number of foremen is as large as in the substantial-sized trust. In a kolkhoz in the Kuybyshev region of 235 members, 48 occupy administrative posts. Near the kolkhoz, there is a ford assigned to the ferryman. Quote, fording assistant, end quote. Besides a blacksmith, there is a, quote, blacksmith's assistant, end quote. To the beekeeper of the kolkhoz is assigned a, quote, hive assistant, end quote. To the president of the kolkhoz is assigned a deputy, 3 accountants, 3 bookkeepers, 2 depot foremen, etc. The support for these numerous administrative organs costs too much for the kolkhoz. Sometimes the amounts paid to the, quote, administrators, end quote, reaches almost a quarter of the total annual workdays. This policy is bound to lower the kolkhoz peasants' earnings. Useless functionaries live off their labor. The kolkhozniki expend thousands upon thousands of workdays supporting these idlers. The labor of honest kolkhozniki is depreciated, end quote. Nevertheless, the state law of April 21st, 1940, decreed that based upon the amount of land cultivated, the directors of the kolkhoz should be credited with 45 to 90 workdays per month, i.e., 540 to 1,080 workdays per year, in addition to a monthly salary of 25 to 400 rubles. This gives us a rough average of 800 workdays and 2,400 rubles per year for the bureaucrats on the kolkhoz, while at the same time the, quote, average contribution, end quote, for a kolkhoz peasant was 262 workdays per year, with around 200 rubles in cash added to this amount. The difference between the average income of a kolkhoz peasant and a petty agrarian bureaucrat is on the order of 1 to 5, to which it must be added 1. That the, quote, that the peasant, quote, average, end quote, we are using here also conceivably includes bureaucratic income, and therefore the true average is less. 2. That this ratio involves only the incomes derived from work on the kolkhoz as such, and does not take into account income arising from individual plots. One tends to assume, though, that in this domain, too, the bureaucrats take care of themselves better than they take care of others, with the best and the largest plots, etc. 3. That in any case the peasants' wages represent wages for labor performed, whereas the bureaucrats' salaries, quote, remunerate, quote, spying and administration of the knout, or the knout, K-N-O-U-T. I don't know what that word means. If we leave the realm of distribution to probe more deeply, we can establish without any difficulty that here as everywhere else, this bureaucracy exercises an absolute dictatorship. Here is what the Russian press says about it, quote, a great number of kolkhoz administrative councils, or even just their presidents, violate the kolkhoz code, and, without taking the opinions of the members of the kolkhoz into account, spend money right and left. The Soviet authorities and the party organizations have grown accustomed to these infractions of the kolkhoz code. They do not see that the majority of the peasants have been ousted from the management of the kolkhoz. End quote. Quote, at present, the village Soviets are often removed from the basic question of kolkhoz business and are not interested in the most important problems of economic and cultural life of the village. Currently, it is rare for the villagers to be called for meetings of the Soviets. The questions of village life are considered by the peasants only in exceptional instances. Making hundreds and hundreds of decisions, the Soviets of the Rayon of 10 forget even to bring them to the attention of the villagers who have to carry them out, end quote. These lines hardly merit any analysis. We can easily see the bureaucracy in its monstrous nakedness, barely hidden by the modest euphemisms of its own reporters. The quote of 10, not of 10, often. The quote often, end quote. Okay, I'm gonna make an excuse for myself there. The of, and the 10 of often are fairly far apart. Anyway, the quote often, end quote, rarely, end quote, where one should read always and never. The traits of this agricultural bureaucracy are identical, point by point, with those of its elder sister, the bureaucracy in the factories and that of the state. The same incompetence, the same greediness, the same imbecility, these hundreds of decisions that are not even brought to the attention of those who have to carry them out, which from the point of view of bureaucratic effectiveness places this new, quote, elite of humanity, end quote, beneath the level of the average warrant officer in the bourgeois army. In short, the same need to exploit the worker without limit, and its indispensable corollary, the complete enslavement of the worker at every level. On. The reaction of the peasantry. Amid this unlimited exploitation, amid the dictatorship and terror imposed upon rural workers, the new privileged strata in the villages make their profits. The immense majority of the peasantry can only hate this monstrous regime and struggle against it with all the means it has at its disposal. A study of its reactions in the face of this new mode of exploitation is of the utmost interest for revolutionary theory and politics. Under every regime and in every era, the reaction of the exploited when faced with exploitation always begins by manifesting itself in the same way: hostility to production itself, indifference as to production's results. Both within ancient slavery as well as among modern wage earners, this reaction, much more than the mode of exploitation itself, separates the results of production from the remuneration of the worker. Pay based upon output, whatever form it comes in, has been the means by which the exploiting class has tried to combat this reaction of, quote, its, end quote, proletarians, a reaction that challenges the very existence of the exploiting society. The distribution of the kolkhoz's agricultural produce between the state, which takes both the impersonal form of the state collector and the embodied form of the kolkhoz bureaucracy, and the peasant producer, constitutes, as it happens in the present case, a kind of, quote, output-based pay, end quote. For the kolkhoznik is remunerated in proportion to the harvest, and this harvest is theoretically, and at the very least partially, a function of the quantity and quality of the labor provided. Nothing perhaps illustrates the burden of this bureaucratic exploitation on the peasantry so well as the fact that, despite this link between its income and the results of the kolkhoz productivity, and the result of the kolkhoz production. Jesus Christ, I need to reread that whole sentence. I'm freaking out. Nothing perhaps illustrates the burden of this bureaucratic exploitation on the peasantry so well as the fact that, despite this link between its income and the results of kolkhoz production, the peasantry constantly and obstinately refuses to work the kolkhoz field. The introduction of forced labor in the countryside, to which the bureaucracy has been obliged to resort, testifies to this refusal. In its effort to evade bureaucratic exploitation to the greatest extent possible, the peasantry has found, and will continue to find for a long time, an outlet in the small individual farming plots the bureaucracy was obliged to let them tend after it overwhelmingly won the battle for, quote, collectivization, end quote. The peasantry is incapable of living on the miserable income gained from its share of kolkhoz production. Since before the war, it has turned toward the more and more intense cultivation of its individual plots. This phenomenon, therefore, has an immediate economic root cause. This root cause in no way is to be found in the, quote, low level of the forces of production, end quote, as some have tried to make us believe, but rather in unbridled exploitation, as conducted by the bureaucracy, for this phenomenon is the direct result of the insufficient income that accrues from kolkhoz farming. It has in addition a social significance that must be analyzed because considerable errors have been committed on this score in the Marxist movement. The peasants need to devote a great deal of their time and their resources to the cultivation of individual plots results from the unprecedented exploitation with which the bureaucratic state burdens the kolkhozy. Not only does this phenomenon have nothing to do with the peasants' supposedly eternal, quote, individualistic tendencies, end quote, but it also is not determined by the, quote, low level of the productive forces, end quote, of Russia's agrarian economy. Even within the framework of the existing forces of production in Russia, which have proved perfectly capable of mechanizing and fertilizing the kolkhoz farms, at least to the extent necessary for their rational existence, the peasants are perfectly capable of understanding and doubtless have understood the tremendous advantages of large-scale mechanized cultivation as opposed to traditional plot farming. These advantages, however, exist only from the point of view of material productivity, and are as a consequence wholly theoretical from the point of view of the peasant producer. The most backward and most reactionary, the most brutish of peasants is bound to understand, after a year or two of experience, that when he farms the land by mechanized means and uses chemical fertilizers and specially bred seeds, considerably higher yields can be attained with an incomparably smaller expenditure of labor. What good are these yields, however, if the produce is seized by the exploiter? Let us assume that in working 100 days a year on the kolkhoz's land and using modern methods, 10 peasants harvest 1,000 quintals of wheat, and that in devoting the same number of days to their own plot, they each harvest only 30. What does this totally abstract yield matter to the peasants? What does it matter to them that in their work on the kolkhoz, they each have produced 100 quintals, whereas their work on the individual plot has yielded only 30? When they know that once the state's collections have been deducted, once they have made their mandatory sales to the MTS and covered the legal, quote, remunerations, end quote, of local bureaucrats, they will receive only 20 to 25 quintals from this miraculous harvest. Under such conditions, individual plot farming still proves to be more profitable. The peasant will think, these methods are too good for me. Casting a melancholy glance towards the tractor, he will say to himself, we really could do some good work with these machines if they left us the hell alone, and he will start to go back to his little patch of land. But he will not go away anywhere at all, because he is not free to go away, because he is obliged to work on the kolkhoz unless he wants to be taken away. On the other hand, when he is working on it, he will put in the minimum amount of work possible. Thus, on the basis of the present configuration of the forces of production, bureaucratic exploitation pushes the peasants toward individual plot farming. But what is the sociological signification of this phenomenon? We hardly need mention that, objectively, this is a retrograde tendency. however justified it might be from the point of view of the exploited peasants' immediate interests, and even from their simple biological need for self-preservation under a regime which makes it by definition impossible to make any demands. But what we need to do here is understand its place within the development of the peasantry's social and political consciousness. To understand this problem better, we need to compare it to an analogous stage in the development of proletarian consciousness. At the beginning of the capitalist era, the proletariat perceived that the introduction of mechanization signified a tremendous heightening of its exploitation, did not immediately and directly move towards revolutionary solutions, or merely, quote, progressive, end quote, ones. Its first reaction were for the most part retrograde and objectively reactionary. It smashed machines and wanted to go back to artisanal forms of production, wherein each person was able to set himself up as a small independent producer. Mutatis mutandis, these responses express the same illusion that it is possible to, quote, go back, end quote. The same search for a utopian solution as is found among the kolkhoz peasants in the turn toward individual plot farming. The working class had to endure a long and twofold period of apprenticeship. First of all, it had to learn that the introduction of capitalist machinery in production is inevitable, and then that it is possible to utilize this machinery precisely for the purpose of abolishing exploitation. It is only when it understands that it is impossible to go back, and indeed that there is no need to go back in order to limit and abolish exploitation. It is only when the necessity of capitalism and the possibility of its being overturned become clearly apparent to it that it begins to take its position on the field of revolution. All things being equal, the same holds true for the peasant class as mechanization and the domination of the capitalist bureaucracy come to be introduced into agriculture. The study of the development of the peasantry's class consciousness along these lines goes beyond the confines of our analysis, but on two fundamental points we should back up the analogy we have put forth. At the same time, this will permit us to avoid erroneous conceptions on this question that have gained currency within the revolutionary movement. For the development of the peasantry to take place in the direction we have outlined, i.e. in a revolutionary direction, the inevitable character of its situation must first of all be demonstrated to it irrefutably. The illusory character of every attempt to, quote, go back, end quote, must be proven to it during a trial period that is sufficiently long and relevant to the situation. This will take place only to the extent that such a return really is impossible. That is, only to the extent that the restoration of, quote, private, end quote, capitalism is excluded as a possibility. After that, another solution, the revolutionary solution, must appear to it as possible. This implies, on the one hand, the technical progress and the development of the forces of production continue, and on the other hand, that the parasitic and useless character of the dominant class becomes plainly evident. We will be very brief concerning the second aspect of this question. The forces of production still are continuing to develop. This is a fact, and it is no less true in agriculture than in the other branches of industry. As long as the struggle between different dominant classes goes on, these classes will be obliged to continue applying the latest production techniques, certainly in a contradictory, irrational manner and with tremendous waste, but with real results, for their very existence is at stake. And as this development occurs, the parasitic character of the ruling class can become more and more clearly evident to the producers. On the other hand, we must insist much more strongly upon the other aspect of this problem, namely how to demonstrate to the peasantry in practical terms the impossibility of going back, of any kind of restoration of the traditional private mode of farming the land. It is well known that Stalin gave 3 spectacular demonstrations of this proposition during the first bloody battle over, quote, collectivization, end quote, 1929, during the instauration of forced labor on the Caucasus, 1939. Excuse me, I feel like I misread something. It is well known that Stalin gave 3 spectacular demonstrations of this proposition during the first bloody battle over, quote, collectivization, end quote, 1929, during the instauration of forced labor on the Caucasus, 1939, and during the expropriation through the, quote, monetary reforms, end quote, of the savings of the well-to-do peasant strata, which they had built up during the war. Each time the famous, quote, struggle between private inclinations and the state-run economy, end quote, was resolved in the favor of the state-run economy. It could not have been otherwise. In its struggle against the peasants', quote, individualist, end quote, reactions, the state bureaucracy has at its disposal formidable weapons on the economic, political, and social levels that put the petty producer at its mercy. Moreover, the whole dynamic of the modern economy assures for the bureaucracy the personification of centralized capital, an inevitable victory over individual small plot farming. This seems obvious to a Marxist. Nevertheless, from the very first years of the Russian Revolution, Lenin developed an incorrect position on this score that as it was later taken up by Trotsky and the left opposition, was a constant source of errors within the vanguard of the movement. This position constantly introduced crucial mistakes into its perspective and prevented it from correctly appreciating the nature of the Russian state. Here is one among hundreds of Lenin's quotations that can be found to this effect. Quote, "The dictatorship of the proletariat is the most determined and most relentless war against a more powerful enemy. The bourgeoisie, whose resistance has increased tenfold by their overthrow, even if only in a single country, and whose power lies not only in the strength of international capital, in the strength and durability of their international connections, but also in the force of habit, in the strength of small-scale production. Unfortunately, small-scale production is still extremely widespread in the world, and small-scale production engenders capitalism, and the bourgeoisie continually, daily, hourly, spontaneously, and on a mass scale." End quote. As for Trotsky, we hardly need recall that he thought the entire history of social change in Russia since 1921, as far as this development was a function of indigenous factors, was determined by the continuous pressure exerted over the, quote, socialist forms of state property, end quote, by the elements trying to restore private capitalism, NEP men, or NEP men, New Economic Policy men, and kulaks. The domination of the bureaucracy was explained in the final analysis only as a point of equilibrium between the two, quote, fundamental forces, end quote, the urban proletariat and the bourgeois elements of town and country. For Trotsky, the economic basis of this conception was to be found in Lenin's idea about how simple market production constantly and unfailingly begets capitalism. This idea, however, is false. At the very least, it is false in its general formulation. Simple market production has existed for thousands of years, whereas capitalism has appeared only during the past few centuries. Simple market production is absolutely incapable as such of leading to capitalism. It is another if its other conditions do not exist. In addition to a certain level of the forces of production, these conditions are the existence of labor power as a commodity, the possibility of privately appropriating the basic means of production, and the existence of capital, i.e. of a mass of values great enough to yield surplus value, in the form of private property. Now these are precisely the crucial conditions for the passage from simple market production to private capitalist production, conditions that simple market production as such not only cannot automatically create, but that by the operation of its own rules it tends to prevent from arising, as proven by the history of artisanal production in Western Europe. And these are the essential conditions lacking in Russia. Labor power no longer exists as a commodity. With respect to its employment within production, this commodity has been subjected to the state's absolute buying monopoly, for the state alone may employ, quote, wage, end quote, labor in production. It no longer is possible to appropriate for oneself the means of production, nor does there exist any longer the opportunity to amass the amount of values required to buy the machinery, raw materials, and labor power necessary to get a capitalist enterprise going. Consequently, any increase in values that an individual can, by hook or by crook, come to amass can only be hoarded rather than productively accumulated by the individual, except within extremely narrow limits on which the state keeps close tabs. But the idea we are criticizing here contains an even more basic error. Not only are the fundamental conditions for the passage from simple market production to private capitalist Not only are the fundamental conditions for passage from simple market production to private capitalist production lacking in Russia, but the dynamic features and the automatic mechanism inherent in this economy each day doom such small-scale production more and more to the advantage of centralized capital. The connections between simple market production and the birth of capitalism can be debated without end. Today we are not in the 17th or the 18th century, but smack dab in the middle of the 20th. The capitalism we have before us is not nascent capitalism. It is a capitalism that is beginning to transcend the stage of monopolistic concentration to achieve a complete integration of production on a worldwide scale. Let us leave aside for a moment the Russian case and examine the case of a mere monopoly in an ordinary capitalist country. Suppose someone has just told us that Ford or General Motors is seriously threatened by the garage mechanics who fix cars, and that the American state does not really express the power of the Fords and the Morgans, but rather a quote, equilibrium, end quote, between them and the thousands of garage mechanics, shoe repairers, etc. How will this joker be received? Now it is clear that in Russia we have not merely, quote, a few, end quote, monopolies, but one single gigantic monopoly with everything at its disposal: capital, raw materials, labor power, foreign trade. This one monopoly is above the law. It is identical with the state. It expropriates, kills, deports no matter whom, no matter when, and is guided solely by the interests of a ruling stratum whose very existence is indissolubly linked to this universal monopoly. From a purely economic point of view, what is the relation of forces between the universal monopoly and any cluster of small individual producers? Is it not as clear as day that these latter are historically lost, doomed, without the least hope? Lenin and Trotsky knew very well that if the Russian Revolution were isolated, it would face mortal dangers that might end in the restoration of an exploitative regime. But they were deceiving themselves when they thought they saw the real source of this danger in the existence of millions of small independent producers, i.e. in a phenomenon that has lost its importance even in capitalist countries. These small, quote, independent, end quote, producers, in fact, have been annexed and are exploited, either directly or indirectly, by centralized capital. They did not foresee, and Trotsky refused to the end to see, that the real danger was coming from the bureaucracy and not the kulaks, who had been used by the bureaucracy as a reserve army during the first phase of its struggle, which has been conducted against the proletariat. After its victory in this struggle, the only one of historical importance, the bureaucracy turned around against the small, quote, independent, end quote, producers, and proved with some brutality that this, quote, independence, end quote, belonged to the 19th century and merely had to be buried along with the horse and buggy and wooden plows. All that remains to be said are a few words on the signification of the kolkhoz market from this standpoint. This market is entirely subordinate to the state-run economy, first of all by the state monopoly over the conditions of agricultural production, farming machinery, fertilizer, consumer products, labor time, the set price and set amount of the delivery quota for agricultural produce, in the final analysis, the earth itself. Most of these factors that the state has at its complete disposal operate continuously, and thus allow the bureaucracy to keep the development of the rural economy under constant supervision. Among these factors are the set price of the delivery quota for agricultural produce, the set amount for this quota, and the price of consumer products. Other factors operate over the long run, and the state uses them less frequently. It can increase the amount of mandatory work time on the kolkhoz. By this means, production time at the disposal of the peasantry is limited and production time at the disposal of the state is augmented. Finally, if driven to it by critical circumstances, the state can recall that it is, quote, the owner, unquote, of the land, and thereby send yet another few million peasants to Siberia. Among all these factors, the one that currently is of greatest importance is its possession of extremely large stocks of agricultural produce, at least 40% of production. By exercising this control, it can exert decisive pressure on the market. Activity on the kolkhoz market, therefore, cannot stray beyond certain very rigid limits. These limits prevent it from being able to challenge anything essential to the bureaucratic economy. As for its social signification, it must not be forgotten that activity on this market consists of exchanges between the most privileged strata of the kolkhozy and the urban bureaucratic strata. In nearly every respect, these strata alone have at their disposal either a surplus of produce or a surplus of money, which is needed to give them a share of the market. The historical signification of the kolkhoz system. We have seen that the fundamental contradiction of every modern system of exploitation is expressed with particular force within the confines of the kolkhoz economy. The exploiting bureaucracy's tendency to increase both production and exploitation to the hilt sets the producers against this system of production. In the case of Russian agriculture, this reaction simultaneously manifests itself in the peasants' negative attitude toward kolkhoz production and in their tendency to fall back on individual small plot farming. This double reaction tends to result in a lowering of agricultural labor productivity, or in any case, at the current stage, productivity does not increase proportionately with the amount of capital employed, with the new farming methods that have been introduced, etc. And as a consequence, limits are placed on the amount of surplus production at the direct or indirect disposal of the bureaucracy. To this limitation, the bureaucracy can only respond with bureaucratic measures in the profoundest sense of this term. Police enforcement, the instauration or augmentation of forced labor, raising the rate of surplus production, the installment of a bureaucratic stratum in the kolkhozy, whose function is to, quote, direct, end quote, and to try to extract a maximum of effort from the producers. All these measures, however, tend to have results that are contrary to those desired. Increased exploitation brought about by raising the rate of surplus production and by adding the maintenance costs of a new stratum of unproductive bureaucrats, and the escalation of police repression only reinforce the producers' conviction that this type of production is hostile to their interests. Consequently, it diminishes their willingness to produce. On the other hand, the kolkhoz bureaucracy's unproductive consumption and the wastefulness it organically gives rise to in the sphere of production are an additional and in no way negligible cause of the limitation on surplus production at the disposal of the central bureaucracy. To this new limitation, the bureaucracy responds with more oppression, more exploitation, and so on. We have an absurd spiral that is profoundly characteristic of a completely exploitative regime, which can only end in a stagnant economy. It would be wrong to assume that the bureaucracy has no awareness of this process. The measures it constantly is taking against itself are not just intended for the purposes of demagogy, although there is much of that to be found in them too. For the central bureaucracy not only takes into account the profound ineffectiveness of the measures it has drawn up in order to increase production. The central bureaucracy also always tends to minimize the latitude granted and the earnings allowed to subordinate and peripheral strata. And such are par excellence the kolkhoz bureaucratic strata. Here too, as in every exploitative regime, we see the same opposition between the state, the general and abstract expression of the interests of the ruling class, and the daily immediate interests of the particular members of this class. This struggle of the bureaucracy against its most deep-seated, most ingrained traits, however, can have no decisive outcome. The unbridled exploitation practiced by the kolkhoz bureaucracy on the peasants for its own benefit is based upon the discretionary powers over these peasants that have been given to it to make them produce. Exploitation, quote, beyond permissible limits, end quote, and discretionary powers go hand in hand. How can one limit the former without abolishing the latter? And how can one abolish the latter if coercion is the only thing capable of making the peasants work on the kolkhoz? The contradiction is inescapable. The only possible apparent solution is bureaucratic super-control over the bureaucracy. The only possible apparent solution is bureaucratic super-control of the bureaucracy over the bureaucracy. Here is the principal economic root cause for the all-powerful GPU, which was the Cheka, I guess between the Cheka and the NKVD. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe. Who knows? How can we characterize the historical role of the bureaucracy in the area of agriculture? This question assumes an importance that is all the more considerable since, up till now, the bureaucracy has taken power in countries where, with the sole exception of Czechoslovakia, agriculture has constituted both the occupation of the majority of the population and the basic source of national income. It may be said that this role appears to be the realization of concentration in the domain of agriculture, up to the limits compatible with a regime that completely exploits the producers, and going hand in hand with this first component, an enormous leap forced upon the development of the forces of production in this sector. In this very general sense, the bureaucracy merely continues to carry out the task undertaken by the capitalist bourgeoisie, which was to develop and concentrate the forces of production, and this is occurring, as it turns out, in the countries where this bourgeoisie has proven itself inadequate to the task. But the bureaucracy accomplished this task during a specific period, that of worldwide capitalist decadence. This is a period during which the forces of production tend to develop at a slower and slower rate, while the triumph of concentration is expressed quite often in indirect and roundabout ways. The influence of the general degradation of capitalism is manifested with a particular force in agriculture, and it is not by accident that the upheaval brought about by the bureaucracy has been and will continue to be experienced to the most far-reaching extent in agriculture. Never did the bourgeoisie achieve so quickly the total expropriation of the great majority of the direct producers. The massive introduction of industrial processes in the area of soil cultivation, the concentration of agricultural farming units, and the universal centralization of their control and management, or the exodus en masse of the peasants to urban industry. And never has the development of the forces of production been paid for with so much blood, sweat, and tears, nor has the burden of exploitation and oppression ever come crashing down on workers so heavily. The bureaucracy brings this upheaval about through the kolkhoz form it imposes upon agrarian production. We must understand, therefore, the necessary connection between the bureaucracy and the kolkhoz system. This will allow us to give concrete shape to the idea set forth earlier, that the role of the bureaucracy in agriculture is the realization of concentration up to the limits compatible with the complete exploitation of the workers. In the industrial domain, it is impossible to set any limits on the development of concentration short of the total concentration of social capital in the hands of a single dominant group. This implies that at the present stage the management of industrial production as a whole is identical, from the economic standpoint, to the management of a single enterprise whose different production sectors are like workshops scattered over various locations. This process leading towards total concentration implies that the rationalization of the ruling class's goals has already been carried out to a tremendous degree. The basic obstacle this rationalization effort comes up against is an internal one. It derives from the fact that production relies on exploitation, and that a rational organization of production by and for an exploiter class is impossible when the class estranges itself from the workers, when in short it is in itself alienated and estranged from production. In this argument concerning the possibility of a total concentration of production in a system of exploitation, is this argument concerning the possibility of a total concentration of production in a system of exploitation applicable to agriculture as well? We think not. As we have already stressed, a fundamental characteristic of the kolkhoz system is the attempt to keep the producers interested to a certain degree in, quote, collective, end quote, production. Their remuneration is tied to the results of production, i.e. to the harvest. We have pointed out that a similar phenomenon may be observed in industry, piece rate wages. In that case, however, its import is incomparably narrower, for it is infinitely more possible to establish control over both the quantity and quality of labor provided in industry. It is thus the setting of norms and the supervision over their fulfillment that play the fundamental role. In agriculture, by way of contrast, it is nearly impossible to achieve this kind of control. Production operations take place in an extended space. A small number of producers are dispersed over a great area, instead of having a great number of them within the four walls of a shop. Neither the quantity nor the quality of work and its results are immediately apparent, unlike in industry, but rather appear many months later. Finally, production does not take place under artificial, stable, and constantly identical conditions, but occurs rather under conditions that are independent of human will, unstable and changing, and in the face of which a perpetual effort of adaptation is necessary on the part of the producer. All these factors make it practically impossible to exercise total control over agricultural labor, unless each laborer is followed by a supervisor. Consequently, in a regime that carries exploitation to its limits and that cannot count on any sort of voluntary cooperation on the part of the workers, it is almost impossible to completely transform peasants into pure and simple wage earners. It is absolutely necessary to establish between them and the results of production some specific kind of connection. This connection must prevent them from losing complete interest in these results, while reserving for the state the main share of production, a share that can be enlarged at will. From this point of view, the kolkhoz form, not in its secondary features, but rather in what is essential to the kolkhoz, tends to represent the natural and organic form of peasant exploitation within the framework of bureaucratic capitalism. It is also an ultimate form of concentration and rationalization of agricultural production compatible with the unlimited exploitation of labor. The end.